On Friday, September 13, 1985, a 34-year-old woman named Helen Vance departed CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, with 7 classified documents affixed to the small of her back beneath her blouse. The subsequent afternoon, these documents commenced their transit to Moscow, handed over amidst the pandemonium of a K-Mart blue light special in Springfield, Virginia. Within 72 hours, they would be situated on a desk at KGB headquarters, having navigated a network so deeply integrated into the fabric of American suburban life that it had operated undetected for nearly 18 months. Helen Vance had not initially intended to become a traitor. Born in 1951 in Akron, Ohio, to a middle-class family, she was the second of 3 children. Described by her high school educators as diligent and organized, she attended Ohio State University, pursuing a major in science. She graduated in 1973 with respectable grades and no particular aspirations beyond securing stable employment. In 1974, she applied for a position as a documentation clerk at the Central Intelligence Agency, attracted by the prospect of favorable benefits and consistent work. The hiring process spanned 7 months. She underwent extensive background investigations, polygraph examinations, and interviews that delved into every facet of her life. The investigators found nothing to raise concerns. She was precisely the kind of individual the CIA sought for its administrative ranks: dependable, unremarkable, and wholly trustworthy. In June 1974, she obtained her security clearance and commenced her duties in a windowless office where her primary responsibilities included cataloging, filing, and occasionally reproducing classified materials for distribution to authorized personnel. For the initial decade of her tenure, Helen Vance's conduct offered no indication of anything beyond ordinary dedication. She was punctual, maintained impeccable records, and engaged in social interactions just enough to avoid appearing reclusive. She resided alone in a modest 1-bedroom apartment in Arlington, drove a 1979 Honda Civic, and managed her $24,000 annual salary effectively to sustain a comfortable, if unexciting, lifestyle. The financial strain began in March 1984 when Helen's father suffered a severe stroke that left him partially paralyzed and unable to work. Her mother could not manage his care by herself. Helen's elder brother resided in California, burdened by substantial student loan debt, while her younger sister worked as a waitress in Cleveland and struggled to make rent. The responsibility devolved upon Helen. She began sending money home, $300 per month initially, then $500, then $700 as medical expenses escalated. She secured personal loans and opened new credit cards in an increasingly desperate effort to remain solvent. By the spring of 1984, Helen Vance was $31,000 in debt and overwhelmed. She could not request a salary increase, as her position was dictated by strict civil service pay scales. She could not accept a second job, as her security clearance necessitated reporting any outside employment. Declaring bankruptcy would trigger a security review. She felt trapped, suffocated by obligations she had never sought but could not bring herself to relinquish. And within that suffocation, within that specific confluence of financial desperation and access to valuable information, the seed of betrayal found fertile ground. The initial contact occurred on June 7, 1984. Helen was shopping at her regular K-Mart on a Thursday evening when a man in his late 40s with graying hair initiated a conversation. He stated he was new to the area and introduced himself as Robert Wilson, claiming to work in IT consulting. When Helen mentioned her government employment, his interest appeared polite and professional, nothing more. She encountered him again 3 weeks later in the housewares aisle. The conversation lasted longer on this occasion, naturally drifting toward the cost of living in Northern Virginia, the expense of everything, and the difficulty of getting ahead. Helen found herself confiding about her parents' circumstances and the financial pressure. Robert Wilson listened with apparent genuine sympathy. The third encounter on July 19, 1984, was not coincidental, though Helen was unaware of this. They strolled through the store together, and he suggested coffee. They proceeded to a Denny's 2 blocks away and conversed for 90 minutes. He posed gentle questions about her work, nothing that seemed intrusive. Helen, yearning for connection and worn down by stress, found herself speaking more openly than she had intended. At the conclusion of their discussion, Robert Wilson made his move with calculated precision. He mentioned that he occasionally undertook freelance consulting for various organizations, involving research and information gathering, and that there were individuals who would compensate well for insights into governmental documentation systems. He stated that if she were ever interested in earning extra money, he could arrange something. He scribbled a phone number on a napkin, slid it across the table, and advised her to consider it. Helen Vance took the napkin and placed it in her wallet. She did not call the number for 18 days. During those 18 days, she learned that her father required a specialized wheelchair that insurance would not cover, at a cost of $4,200. She sat at her kitchen table with a calculator, a stack of credit card statements, and the napkin bearing Robert Wilson's phone number, and she made a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of her life. She called the number on August 6, 1984. The arrangement was established with remarkable efficiency. Robert Wilson, whose actual name was Boris Vetronov, and who was employed by the KGB's first chief directorate operating out of the Soviet embassy in Washington, met Helen Vance at a park in Alexandria on August 11th. They sat on a bench overlooking the Potomac River, and he articulated his needs with perfect clarity. He required classified documents, actual materials that passed through her hands at the CIA. He offered $2,000 per document initially, with the rate increasing based on the document's value. Helen Vance should have risen and departed, but she did not. She remained seated on that bench and listened. As Boris Vetronov explained the mechanics of espionage with casual efficiency, the money was the primary motivation, she later testified. But there was something else as well. There was a peculiar exhilaration in being solicited, in being perceived as someone valuable enough to recruit, in wielding influence over something for the first time in a life defined by powerlessness. She consented to his terms. They discussed methodology. Helen could not simply walk out of Langley with classified documents in a bag or briefcase. Security personnel routinely inspected such items. And even in 1984, random inspections were frequent enough to render that method perilous. However, she could transport documents on her person. Vetronov provided her with medical tape and specific instructions. Documents were to be folded twice, affixed to the small of her back, or, for smaller materials, to the inside of her thigh. The placement was deliberate. Security guards at Langley rarely conducted physical searches of personnel, and certainly never strip searches without probable cause. As a documentation clerk, she had legitimate access to photocopiers, and she had learned over a decade precisely when security personnel were least attentive and which times of day offered the most cover. She would make copies during her legitimate work, tape them to her body, and depart. Once at home, she would photograph the documents with a 35mm camera Vetronov provided, then destroy the photocopies. The transfer method necessitated creativity. Vetronov could not simply meet her regularly at predetermined locations. Such patterns were too easily detected by FBI surveillance teams. They needed a method embedded within the natural flow of American suburban life. The solution originated with Helen herself. She mentioned that she shopped at K-Mart almost every Saturday afternoon. Vetronov immediately recognized the potential. K-Mart stores in the mid-1980s were sprawling retail environments with constant customer traffic and minimal security. Even better, K-Mart featured its Blue Light Special. The Blue Light Special had been introduced by K-Mart in 1965 as a means of fostering excitement within its stores. At unpredictable intervals throughout the day, a store employee would activate a rotating blue police-style beacon light mounted on a pole and announce over the public address system that a special discount was available on specific merchandise for a limited duration, typically 15 minutes. The announcement would trigger a surge of customers rushing to the location of the blue light, creating a brief period of concentrated activity and controlled chaos. By the mid-1980s, the Blue Light Special had become so ingrained in American consumer culture that it was recognized by virtually every suburban shopper in the country. For espionage purposes, the Blue Light Special was nearly perfect. The surges of customer traffic provided natural cover for brief encounters. The timing was unpredictable, meaning any meeting would appear spontaneous rather than pre-planned. And because Helen legitimately shopped at K-Mart every Saturday, her presence would never seem suspicious. Vetronov refined the method. They would meet on alternating Saturdays, but only during the blue light special that occurred shortly after 2 p.m. Helen would browse normally, carrying the film canister in her purse. When a blue light special was announced, she would make her way to the designated area. Vetronov would also proceed towards the blue light. The actual transfer would occur in the brief crush of activity. A purse brushing against a shopping basket. A film canister passed in less than 3 seconds, visually indistinguishable from the normal jostling of shoppers competing for bargains. They tested the method on August 25, 1984, using blank film. It functioned flawlessly. Vetronov gave Helen $1,000 in cash and instructed her to commence photographing documents. The initial restricted documents photographed by Helen Vance were dated the 4th and 5th of September 1984 and pertained to Central Intelligence Agency evaluations concerning Soviet military assistance to the Sandinista administration in Nicaragua. As a documentation clerk, Helen did not have access to the most highly sensitive materials, but she was able to access a broad spectrum of classified information, including operational dispatches and analytical reports that constituted the fundamental infrastructure of intelligence activities. On the 6th of September, a Thursday, during her midday break, Helen utilized one of the reproduction rooms located on the 3rd floor to duplicate 6 pages of material. She waited until 1:15 in the afternoon, swiftly made her reproductions, folded them twice, and affixed them to her lower back beneath her blouse. She departed from the Langley facility that evening, the documents pressed against her skin, and drove to her residence where she dedicated 2 hours to photographing them with the camera that Vronov had supplied. The camera itself was concealed within a hollowed-out lexicon on her bookshelf, while the exposed film was hidden within her freezer, tucked inside a bag of frozen peas, where the frigid temperature would preserve the emulsion and prevent the latent images from deteriorating. Saturday, the 8th of September, 1984, was marked by humidity and an overcast sky. Helen arrived at the K-Mart located on Backlick Road shortly before 2 o'clock in the afternoon, with the film canister secured in her handbag. At 2:31 in the afternoon, an announcement was made. "Attention K-Mart shoppers, we have a blue light special in our small appliances section for the next 15 minutes. Helen made her way toward the rear of the establishment where approximately 15 individuals had already congregated. Vetronov was present, attired in different clothing than she had previously observed, and he was carrying a small shopping basket. Helen positioned herself in proximity to the coffee makers, her right hand resting on her purse. Petronov advanced closer, reaching for a coffee maker situated on the shelf above where Helen was standing. As he extended his arm, his basket came within inches of her purse. The film canister slipped from her purse into the basket, an action that transpired in approximately 2 seconds. Vronov departed immediately, while Helen remained at the display for an additional 3 minutes. The exchange had been so seamless, so unremarkable, that it was almost anticlimactic. She had merely navigated a suburban retail environment and engaged in espionage that was visually indistinguishable from the acquisition of discounted goods. 3 days later, she discovered an envelope in her mailbox containing $14,000 in cash. Helen Vance regarded the money, a sum greater than she had ever possessed, and felt the profound significance of her actions. She settled 2 credit card accounts, remitted $3,000 to her mother, and deposited the remainder into a newly established savings account. Over the subsequent months, the pattern solidified with mechanical precision. Helen would photograph documents during the week. Every other Saturday, during a blue light special, she would pass a film canister to Vronov. The payments arrived with regularity, and the amounts escalated. By December of 1984, Helen was receiving $3,000 per document. By March of 1985, certain materials merited $5,000. The documents that Helen Vance supplied to Soviet intelligence between September of 1984 and December of 1985 represented a substantial security breach. She transmitted information pertaining to CIA operations in Afghanistan, surveillance reports detailing FBI monitoring of Soviet diplomatic personnel, assessments of Soviet military capabilities within Eastern Europe, and the identities of 3 CIA assets operating in East Germany, information that would lead to their apprehension by the Stasi. Helen was aware that the documents were detrimental. She read the content of what she photographed. She understood that the intelligence she furnished enabled the Soviet Union to counteract American operations and neutralize individuals acting against their interests. Yet she did not cease. The financial remuneration had become indispensable, deeply integrated into her life in ways that rendered its severance catastrophic. Beyond the monetary aspect, there was a sense of momentum. The manner in which each successful transfer made the subsequent one appear more routine, less transgressive. The blue light special transfers evolved into a peculiar ritual. Every other Saturday, she would drive to K-Mart, shop as usual, await the sales announcement, and complete the exchange amidst suburban shoppers seeking bargains. The locations varied. Housewares one week, sporting goods the next, electronics, toys. The merchandise shifted, but the method remained constant. On November 17, 1984, Helen passed documents concerning CIA infiltration of Soviet secure communications during a blue light special on bathroom fixtures. On January 12, 1985, she delivered satellite reconnaissance schedules during a blue light special on women's winter coats. On March 23, 1985, she conveyed assessments of Soviet biological weapons research during a blue light special on children's toys. Each transfer was executed in mere seconds, imperceptible to any organized surveillance. However, Helen Vance was not invisible. By the later part of spring in 1985, she had attracted the attention of the CIA's Office of Security. In April of 1985, during a routine security review, investigators uncovered something unexpected. Credit cards that had previously carried substantial balances were suddenly paid off. An individual earning $27,000 annually had somehow eliminated $31,000 in debt in under 8 months. When investigators examined her personal and tax records, they found no indication of any legitimate financial windfall. The money originated from an undisclosed source, and unidentified sources of funds belonging to an individual with access to classified information are among the most critical warning signs in counterintelligence work. On June 3, 1985, the Office of Security initiated a preliminary inquiry. By July of 1985, it had been escalated to a full counterintelligence investigation, and the FBI was involved. On July 22, 1985, they commenced physical surveillance of Helen Vance. The FBI's surveillance was thorough, but not immediately fruitful. Agents followed her daily routines and observed no overt meetings with foreign intelligence officers. For the initial 3 weeks, Helen Vance appeared to be precisely what her personnel file indicated: a quiet, unremarkable government employee. The breakthrough emerged from persistent observation. On August 10, 1985, FBI Special Agent Jennifer Caldwell was reviewing surveillance logs and noted that Helen frequented the same K-Mart store every Saturday afternoon. Caldwell cross-referenced these visits with a database tracking Soviet intelligence officers in Washington. On 4 Saturdays when Helen had been at K-Mart, a Soviet embassy official named Boris Vronov had been documented in the vicinity of Springfield. Vronov was a known KGB officer operating under the guise of a cultural attaché. The correlation could have been coincidental, but in counterintelligence operations, repeated coincidences are never presumed to be innocent. The FBI established intensive surveillance on Helen's Saturday K-Mart excursions. On August 17, 1985, they deployed 6 agents throughout the store, disguised as shoppers. 2 additional agents occupied an unmarked sedan in the parking lot, capturing photographs with telephoto lenses. At 2:38 in the afternoon, a blue light special was announced for kitchen towels. Special Agent Thomas Reeves observed Helen examining towels alongside other patrons. He noted brief physical contact with another shopper, but the interaction was so fleeting that he could not ascertain if anything had been exchanged. The breakthrough originated from the parking lot surveillance team. Agent Michael Chen, reviewing photographs, identified one individual whose timing was suspicious. The man had entered approximately 8 minutes after Helen and departed approximately 12 minutes after the conclusion of the blue light special. The individual in the photograph was Boris Vetronov. On August 20, 1985, the surveillance operation was upgraded to a full counterintelligence task force. The decision was made. They would not apprehend Helen immediately, but would monitor her closely and utilize her as an avenue into Soviet intelligence operations. The surveillance intensified. FBI agents began arriving before Helen on Saturdays, positioning themselves strategically. They placed tracking devices beneath her Honda Civic. They obtained warrants to monitor her telephone and conduct surreptitious entries into her apartment while she was at work. The FBI documented 2 additional transfers on August 31st and September 14th. The covert entries yielded incriminating evidence: a camera with a specialized copy stand, concealed within a hollowed-out dictionary on her bookshelf, rolls of undeveloped film hidden within a bag of frozen peas in her freezer, and bank statements indicating cash deposits totaling approximately $73,000. By mid-September of 1985, the FBI had compiled a comprehensive case. They possessed documentation of Helen's pattern coinciding with Soviet intelligence officers. They had observed suspicious contact during blue light specials. They had discovered document photography equipment and unexplained cash. What they lacked was direct observation of an actual transfer captured with sufficient clarity for prosecution. The challenge was considerable. The blue light special generated controlled chaos. During the 15-minute intervals, 30 to 40 shoppers would converge on a single area, creating a dense mass of people that rendered unobstructed sightlines impossible. FBI agents had to maintain their cover while attempting to observe a 2-second movement through a crowd. The FBI's frustration grew through October and November. They were convinced that Helen was passing documents, but they could not document the transfer with a clarity sufficient for prosecution. The decision was made in late November to implement a more assertive operation. The next anticipated transfer was scheduled for Saturday, December 7, 1985. The FBI planned to deploy 12 agents within the store and 4 in the parking lot. Saturday, December 7, 1985 was cold and clear. Helen Vance departed her apartment and drove to the K-Mart on Backlick Road. FBI surveillance teams had been in position since noon. Special Agent Jennifer Caldwell directed the operation from an inconspicuous van, maintaining contact with her team via covert radio earpieces. Helen entered the establishment and diverged from her usual routine. Rather than perusing garments or home goods, she proceeded directly to the pharmacy aisle, appearing to be in waiting. FBI agents observed this alteration with apprehension. Agent Thomas Reeves monitored Helen as she feigned interest in vitamin supplement labels while frequently consulting her timepiece. At precisely 2:31 in the afternoon, the announcement resonated. A cheerful voice over the public address system proclaimed, "Attention K-Mart shoppers." It heralded a blue light special in the housewares section. Helen immediately proceeded toward housewares with evident purpose. FBI agents converged from various points. The blue light was rotating and shoppers began to congregate around the Corningware display. Helen positioned herself near the periphery of the gathering, keeping her purse held closely. Agent Cordwell managed to enter the area just behind Helen. Cordwell observed Helen's hands, noting her right hand resting on her purse in what seemed like a deliberate manner. The crowd swelled to approximately 30 individuals. Subsequently, Boris Vronov entered from the opposing end, carrying a diminutive shopping basket and wearing a Baltimore Orioles cap along with a brown jacket. Cordwell felt her pulse quicken. She touched the microphone embedded in her collar, transmitting a single word to signal the other agents. Vronov reached the edge of the crowd near Helen. He appeared to be reaching for a cookware set on a shelf situated above the display, extending his arm upwards, and as he did so, his shopping basket swung towards Helen's location. Helen's hand moved, a gesture Caldwell perceived with absolute clarity, witnessing Helen's fingers delicately enter her purse and retrieve a small cylindrical object. Observing this object transition towards Vronov's basket in a fluid, practiced movement. Caldwell saw the film canister pass from Helen's grasp into Vronov's basket. She perceived it vividly enough to provide testimony in court. She touched her microphone once more, transmitting confirmation of the exchange to the entire team. However, Cordwell refrained from issuing the order to apprehend them immediately. As a registered diplomat, Vronov could not be arrested without precipitating a diplomatic incident. The arrest would squarely focus on Helen Vance, and the timing necessitated meticulous management. Cordwell permitted them to separate. Voronoff departed without delay. Walking towards the front of the store, Helen remained at the blue light special for an additional 2 minutes, examining cookware and maintaining her cover. She then also moved away, browsing through women's apparel for several minutes before proceeding towards the exit. Helen traversed the automatic doors at 2:54 in the afternoon and crossed the parking lot towards her Honda Civic. She unlocked the driver's side door and was reaching to open it when Special Agent Jennifer Caldwell approached from behind, accompanied by 2 other agents. Caldwell displayed her FBI credentials at eye level, the gold badge glinting in the December sunlight, and identified herself by name and agency. The request was delivered calmly but with authority, asking Helen to step away from the vehicle. There was no dramatic confrontation, no struggle, no raised voices. Other shoppers loading groceries into their vehicles scarcely noticed the interaction. Helen's face drained of all color. She remained motionless for a moment, then complied, stepping back from the car. She did not inquire about the reason. She did not protest or deny. She simply allowed herself to be escorted to an unmarked sedan parked 3 rows away, was read her Miranda rights, and was transported to the FBI's Washington field office, while other agents remained behind to secure her vehicle. Concurrently, other agents followed Voronoff as he exited the store and entered his vehicle. They photographed him, observed him placing the shopping basket in his trunk, and tailed him back towards the Soviet embassy. Voronoff would be declared persona non grata and expelled from the United States on December 12, 1985, 5 days after the arrest. Helen Vance was placed in an interrogation room and left in solitude for nearly an hour. This was standard procedure, intended to allow the gravity of the situation to fully register with a suspect. When Special Agents Caldwell and Reeves entered at 4:15 in the afternoon, they found Helen seated with her head in her hands. The interrogation was recorded via audio tape, and Caldwell commenced by confirming that Helen understood her rights and that any discussion could be employed as evidence. The agents presented their knowledge. They had been conducting surveillance for months. They were aware of the documents, aware of Voronoff, and aware of the K-Mart transfers. They had witnessed the transfer that afternoon, had other agents who corroborated it, and possessed sufficient evidence to charge her with espionage under the Espionage Act. The prevailing question was whether Helen was amenable to cooperating with the investigation. A prolonged silence ensued. Helen wiped her eyes and resolved to cooperate fully. Over the subsequent 6 hours, Helen Vance provided a complete confession, detailing every aspect of her espionage activities from June 1984 through the transfer that had occurred hours earlier. She elucidated the financial pressures, the recruitment process, and the method of utilizing blue light specials as cover. She furnished dates of every transfer she could recall, amounting to approximately 32 separate instances over 16 months. She described which documents she had photographed and passed on, providing sufficient detail for CIA damage assessment teams to later reconstruct a significant portion of the compromise. She acknowledged receiving approximately $127,000 in cash payments over the 16-month period. She stated she had engaged in these activities for monetary gain, had done so knowingly, and expressed regret for her actions. Helen Vance was formally charged on December 9, 1985, with multiple counts of espionage, conspiracy to commit espionage, and unauthorized disclosure of classified information. The charges carried a potential sentence of life imprisonment. Bail was denied, and she was held at a federal detention facility in West Virginia. The CIA's damage assessment determined that Helen's espionage had resulted in considerable harm. The documents she had supplied included information that directly led to the apprehension and incarceration of 3 CIA assets in East Germany. One individual received 15 years of imprisonment. Helen had also compromised CIA operations in Afghanistan and FBI surveillance of Soviet diplomatic personnel. In February 1986, Helen's attorney negotiated a plea agreement. Helen consented to plead guilty in exchange for a recommended sentence of 25 years rather than life imprisonment. The agreement stipulated her complete cooperation with damage assessment efforts. On March 14, 1986, she appeared in federal court and entered a guilty plea. The sentencing hearing took place on May 2, 1986. The courtroom was closed to the public because portions of the proceedings involved classified information. Federal District Court Judge Harold Pearson sentenced Helen Vance to 30 years in federal prison, 5 years more than recommended. The judge acknowledged Helen's cooperation and the absence of ideological motivation, but emphasized that the magnitude of the harm warranted a sentence that would unequivocally communicate the consequences of betraying national security. Helen Vance served her sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Alderson, West Virginia. She was a model inmate, caused no disciplinary issues, and worked in the prison library. She was released via mandatory release after 20 years in June 2006 at the age of 55. Following her release, Helen relocated to a small town in Pennsylvania where she was employed at a public library. She lived quietly, rarely spoke of her past, and made no attempts to profit from her notoriety. She passed away in November 2019 at the age of 68 from complications related to lung cancer. Boris Vronov was expelled from the United States on December 12, 1985, and returned to Moscow. He was reportedly promoted within the KGB for his successful recruitment and management of Helen. The K-Mart store on Backlick Road, the site of the transfers, continued its operation until 2002, when it ceased functioning as part of K-Mart's corporate restructuring during bankruptcy proceedings. The Blue Light Special program itself was discontinued by K-Mart in 1991, briefly reinstated in 2001, and then ended permanently. The blue rotating lights, once an iconic element of American shopping culture, became relics of retail history.